All right, so you can follow along on the handout I gave you. This comes from Frederick Long's book on Greek grammar. It looks like this. It's quite thick. Um, and it starts on page 51. And forgive me for reading along with you, but I think we'll read some and we'll talk about some, and hopefully this will be a little more clear for you. So first of all, the active voice is pretty simple. The active voice is when the subject is doing or performing the action. When you look up a word in the lexicon, the active voice, particularly specifically when the verb ends in an omega, that's the active voice, the regular meaning of the verb. So that's pretty easy. But then Greek has this voice called middle voice. The middle voice marks the subject's own involvement in the action of the verb. And or in the resultant benefits arising from the action of the verb. So a really clear instance where Greek would employ the middle voice is in Mark 7:4. They washed themselves. So here the ones performing the acts of washing are also affecting themselves. Now English doesn't have that voice, but English uses pronouns and other verb glosses in order to explain that the subject is involved. Now, there are a variety of ways to understand the meaning of the middle. So here under A, we have the reflexive or reciprocal direct middle. This is where the action performed by the subject is actually reflected back to the subject, or if the subject is plural, the action is formed kind of back and forth among a group of people. So we might use reflexive words in English to translate this idea: myself, ourselves, yourself, yourselves, himself, herself, itself, themselves. Greek doesn't need to add that extra word, although we've seen that Greek does have those words. When the Greek uses the middle, those extra words are not necessary. So here's two examples. Matthew 27:5b, we have he hanged himself. He's not hanging anybody else, he's hanging himself, middle voice. We can also have a middle of personal interest. This is the indirect middle, and it expresses that the subject is acting out of personal interest. And this is related to the causative middle, in which the subject causes the action to take place back upon himself or herself. So 2 Timothy 4:15 is you guard yourself against him. It's not just about guarding in general, nor about guarding anyone else. You're guarding yourself. One way to translate this is to add the words with one's own interest in mind. The permissive middle indicates that the subject is allowing something to be done for himself or herself. And Long points out that this is relatively rare. But we have this example in 1 Corinthians 6:7. Why not rather let yourselves be wronged? So why not rather be wronged? It has this idea of allowing oneself to be wrong. Now, it should be said that the middle voice in Koine Greek, and this is why I'm not real pleased with the way Duff has done it here, is sometimes quite significant for interpretation. And some whole exegetical debates concern whether or not one should understand a form as having middle voice sense or passive voice sense. So in Acts 13:48b, they were appointed or they appointed themselves for everlasting life. Which is it? And because we have some tenses, for example, the present tense, when the middle and the passive have the same form, figuring out which it is and which way to translate the meaning becomes a matter of debate. Now, the passive voice is when the subject is being acted upon. This is called the passive voice because the subject does nothing. But except be acted upon. The subject is passive. In the development of the Greek language, the passive voice meaning was initially included in the middle voice forms, but over time the passive voice forms were differentiated in the aorist and the future tenses. But for the present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect, which we haven't gotten to yet, the middle passive forms are identical. So the notions of active and passive are relatively easy to comprehend, and they correspond well to English usage. The active voice is Jesus healed the paralytic. Peter preached the gospel to the people. Jesus wept. But the passive voice is the paralytic was healed by Jesus. The gospel was being preached by Peter, and Jesus was taken away. So, as can be seen above, the same idea can be expressed either actively or passively. So, in A and B, under the active voice, Jesus and the Peter are subjects. Jesus and Peter are subjects. But in A and B, under the passive voice, Jesus and Peter aren't the subjects anymore. Now they're in prepositional phrases. So in the passive voice, the action is being performed onto the subject. The paralytic, the gospel, and Jesus in the passive voice are all doing nothing. They're being acted on. Now, it's helpful to go through on the next page the entries for various Greek words. These are not all Greek words you know, and what we're going to see is sometimes the meanings are obvious, and sometimes the meanings have developed in ways that are a little bit unexpected. And we'll see kind of some of the directions where that goes. We're going to be reading the present tense forms for all of these, but notice that in these present tense forms, there's a difference between the passive meaning and the middle meaning. That means when we come across a verb that could be either passive or middle, we're going to have to try out both of these meanings and see which one fits. Whereas when we come across a verb that's in the future tense, for example, we know which meaning to pick, either the passive or the middle, because they're different. So the first Greek verb is aireo, I take. And in the passive then, we're going to turn that around and say aireo mai means I am taken. So now it's happening to me. But what about the middle? Well, in the middle, aireo mai means I choose or I prefer, which makes sense if we think about this middle sense of I am taking for my own benefit. I'm choosing, I prefer. Anamimnesko means I remind. So anamimneskomai in the passive means I am reminded, or I remember, I recall to mind. But now we're already sliding a little bit into this middle meaning, which has to do with sort of reminding myself, right? Oh, I remember. And those moments when suddenly something comes to mind and nobody did it to you, nobody reminded you, but you were involved in this action of remembering. Apodidomi means to give away. Notice the me ending, it is conjugated a little bit like Amy. And apodidomai then is I am evacuated. In other words, I am taken away. And then we have in this middle form, apodidomai means I make an exchange or I sell. So I've given it away, but I've given it away and I've gotten something back. My own benefit is involved. Apolumi means I destroy. So the passive meaning is going to be I am destroyed, I perish. And here, the middle and the passive meanings have come together so that I perish. Apolumi means I perish, both in the middle and the passive. And sometimes that's the way it happens. A good lexicon is going to help you to determine what the possibilities for meaning are. A dynadzo means I lend, but then dynadzomai means I am lent out. Maybe you're a slave and your master loaned you to somebody else. You would use this passive form. But then in the middle, it means I borrow. And so I lend, but now it's turned around, right? Instead of going this way, I've now done something, but I've done something for my own benefit. I've borrowed. Energeo means I work. But energeomai means he has here, I am actively carried out, but then he says it's only impersonally. So that means it can only be used when you say it is actively carried out. And then in the middle, it is also only imperfect, and it has to do with it working. This thing works. And so we have, maybe we can see a little bit of this middle meaning going on in here. But sometimes, like I said, the middle form takes on a meaning that we can't necessarily make direct connections with the present tense meaning. Epikaleo means I call upon or name. Epikaleomai then very reasonably means I am called. Somebody else does it to me. But then epikaleomai in the middle means I appeal. I'm calling, but I'm calling on someone for my own benefit. Echo, you already know, means I have or hold. Echomai in the passive means someone else possesses me. But echomai in the middle means I cling to. Again, this sense of benefit. I'm holding on to it, but I'm holding on to it because I need it for some reason. Klero'o means I appoint or choose. Klero'o mai means I am appointed, particularly by lot. But then klero'o mai in the middle means I obtain, possess, or receive. So there's the sense that there's my own benefit there again. Komizo means I bring. Komizo mai in the passive means I am conveyed. And then we have I journey, I travel, maybe I come back. But komizo mai in the middle means I get, I receive. So we've turned the bringing back around. Krino means I judge. Klinomai means I am judged, so I'm on trial. And then klinomai, now I'm bringing a lawsuit. So I'm still involved in the action, but I'm doing it for my own benefit. Pao means I stop. Transitive. Now, transitivity is really important here. And if you're not familiar with the term transitivity, a transitive verb is a verb that has or can have a direct object. I throw the ball. Throw is a transitive verb because it takes a direct object. Only transitive verbs can be passive because we need to flip the direct object and the subject, and we can only do that if we have a direct object to become the subject. I throw the ball is thrown, it works that way. But sometimes when you, so let's look at pao, I stop, so I stop the train, I stop the time, I stop the fight. That would be the use there, transitive. Pao o mai is somebody stops me, I am forced to cease. But then in the middle, it's I cease transitively, intransitively rather. So that means I've stopped myself. I cease playing. I cease, these are not, it's not me stopping something else. It's me stopping myself from doing something. And that's the middle meaning there. A patho, I persuade or convince. Pathomai, I am won over as a result of persuasion. I am persuaded. Somebody else persuades me. But now in the middle form, pathomai, I obey or I trust. So I'm persuading myself to follow somebody else. Fulasso is I guard. Fulasomai is I am watched, I am kept under guard. But then in the middle, it's I'm on my guard. I'm watching, I'm being careful. I'm watching for the benefit of myself. I want to do one more thing before I end this video, and that is to switch to this chart that I've given you as well. This is a flow chart. Let me get it on the screen. It's specifically set up for verbs in the present tense, but you could also use it for verbs in the in other tenses as well that have different endings, just by adding a question or two. So but particularly if you're in the present tense or in a tense where the middle and passive are the same, you're going to ask, is the ending active or middle passive? Now, if the passive ending is different, you'd go off this direction and say, oh, well, I have a passive ending. It's in the future tense or the aorist tense. And so I know it's not middle or active. And now I'm going to translate it according to the passive sense of the verb, except for there are a few exceptions at the bottom of page 174 with Duff. Occasionally, there are what's called passive deponents, and that means a verb that has a passive ending but an active meaning. There aren't very many, they're listed there, and those, if you're moving out here on the side and ooh, there's a passive ending, but it's the verb apokrinomai, and I know that the passive ending of apokrinomai, I'm still going to translate it as I answer without the passive sense. It's just another one of those tricky little exceptions to the rule. Most of the time, though, 9 times out of 10, if you have a passive ending, you're going to translate the verb passive with the passive sense. Something else is acting on the subject. But now let's go back to the flowchart as it exists. If you have an active ending, you're just going to use the lexical meaning. Lego, active ending. I speak, lexical meaning. You're good. But what if you have a verb that has an ending that could be middle or passive? And let's say it's in the present tense. Then the next thing you're going to want to find out is this a deponent verb? And the way you figure out if it's a deponent verb is you remember or you check the lexical form. If the lexical form ends in omai, like erkomai, then you know it's a deponent verb. And then even with this middle passive ending, you're going to translate it with the lexical meaning, I go. But if the verb ends in an omega and it has a middle passive ending, remember, now we're going to check the lexicon and see if it gives a different meaning for the middle passive. If it does give a different meaning, and occasionally there is a completely different meaning for the middle passive, then you're going to check and see if it makes sense in context. If it does, you're going to use that meaning. If it doesn't make sense in context, or if the lexicon doesn't give a different meaning for the middle passive, then you're going to try this reflexive sense. Is there a way in which I can translate this middle passive verb in a way that implies the action of the subject acting on itself? If there's a sense in which you can translate it that way, and this chart just mentions the reflexive sense, but we've also seen a couple other possibilities in Long, then that's what you're going to do. But if it doesn't, then you're just going to go ahead and use the passive sense for this middle passive ending. The really important thing, I think, is to separate out these deponent verbs, because you don't have to find a different meaning for deponent verbs. Deponent verbs are just going to have their lexical meaning even with this middle passive ending. And once you've sort of sorted the deponent verbs out of the way, then you can start wrestling with this normally active verb and try to figure out, well, what's going on here? Is this middle or passive? And try out the possible endings. I hope this was somewhat clear. I think it will become clearer when we do exercises together. I look forward to doing that. Take care.